Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, great. Yes, so there was a mix-up on the first question of the quiz.
Oh, yeah.
One of the answers was misworded, so we're sorry about that. We will definitely give you guys the point for that.
Yeah. So Makara, I don't see her here, but Makara pointed out that
But yeah,
Leilani, it's not Leilani, Kelly and I caught some miswording on the quiz where the officers who broke down Breonna Taylor and her boyfriend's door, they were not breaking the law when they did so. Them having a firefight with Breonna Taylor's boyfriend was not illegal. The bullets striking Breonna Taylor were not illegally fired. However, the officer who was firing in the dark, in the direction of Breonna Taylor, none of his bullets hit Breonna, but they hit the wall behind her and entered the room in the next apartment over, endangering the people on the other side of the room. That was illegal, right? And so therefore that's the one criminal charge filed, is reckless endangerment. Now, just because their behavior is legal, I'm not making the argument that it was good, but there have been a lot of people upset that there aren't murder charges filed against these officers. Unfortunately, the prosecutors can't file murder charges against these officers, even though some of them want to, because of the way the law is written. Therefore, some of us keep saying the law needs to change, right? Even if these officers were charged with murder, they could immediately plead not guilty because of the way the laws are, right? Many of us don't like that, but it remains the case. Okay, so thank you very much for pointing that out, Makara. And what other questions or observations do you all have before we start diving into Unit 2?
Matt, this flow chart that I printed off that was at the end of Unit 1, is that something that we're going to need to know for the final, or is it just for informational purposes? What is the sequence of events in the criminal justice system?
Yeah, in fact, let's look at that together. Because the answer is no, I don't think there are any questions on the final on that, but that doesn't diminish its importance. Okay, so let's Unit 1. Hopefully you guys can see my screen. Kelly, can you see what I'm pulling up?
yes.
Excellent. Okay, so let's screen it down at the very end, because I think this whole flow chart is really cool. Of course, we're gonna have a hard time seeing it because it's in landscape. But what is the sequence of events in the criminal justice system? So it shows entry into the system. And so you'll notice that the crime box is so much bigger than reported and observed crime, and then each box gets smaller and smaller through the process. But you'll
Matt,
notice...
does that circle let you rotate it? The little circle next to the page numbers?
Yeah, I'll try that. Ooh, now it's upside down. So, thank you, Kelly. Oh, I love having an adult here. And now I'm craving matcha green tea. Okay, as well as French toast. So you'll notice that every one of these boxes shows the various diversions away from certain forms of prosecution. So look at the top. It goes reported and observed, investigation. You notice how not all crimes that are reported or observed are investigated. And then there's that unsolved and not arrested, means just nothing happens. And then sometimes there is an arrest, released without prosecution. And then there's another smaller box, charges filed, released without prosecution. So there's at every turn, you notice the proportion of crime versus the proportions that are tried gets ever smaller. And so it shows that some of these are misdemeanors. The percentage that are pled out is quite high. And so this is a helpful little graph if you're ever wondering why in the world, there's so much crime that happens, but so few people go to jail. At the same time, though, there's a shocking number of people who go to jail. So yeah, it's interesting, especially because a lot of the majority of people in jail are in jail for drug crimes. And so therefore it's how we investigate crime becomes a source of intervention. So this is FYI, it's informative. I think it's a really cool chart. I like it, so I included it. So please refer to it if you're ever curious. Like, I think that in your forensic psychology folio, like, how when you're a, stand-up professional psychologist, that this would be an important thing to have like at the back of your folio where you can refer back to, okay, what's happening, what's going on here, and just refer back to this flow chart. I find it to be very helpful. Okay. So other questions, observations, etc. Thank you, Becky. Okay, so as a forensic psychologist, the chances of you having a job in the forensic psychology field that do not involve psychological assessment are pretty slim. There are some forensic psychologists who make part of their income just being an amicus curiae, right, friend of the court, doing research for the court systems, etc. But even those forensic psychologists who work in jails, prisons, for police departments, for the FBI, etc., they end up doing a lot of assessment. They end up doing a lot of measurement. And so that's actually, remember what psychologists are. That if you were to watch a marriage and family therapist do therapy, if you were to watch a clinical mental health counselor do therapy, or if you were to watch a social worker do therapy, or a clinical or counseling psychologist do therapy, you wouldn't be able to guess what field of origin they came from, right? In terms of therapy, everybody does therapy in approximately close enough ways that you can't distinguish the marriage and family therapist from the psychologist, from the social worker, from the CMHC, right? What sets psychologists apart is assessment. That is their claim to fame. And so therefore, if you, for those of you who are going to go on and get your doctorate degree in clinical or counseling psychology, with perhaps even a specialization in forensic psychology, then you will take a lot of courses in assessment. And so the most basic assessment we're going to go over today is probably the most important one, and that's what's called the mental status exam. And the mental status exam is an assessment that you can use in a therapeutic setting, in a formal legal setting. There's a lot of different ways in which you can use the mental status exam. So it's a quick and dirty assessment of client functioning. So in our next unit, in Unit 3, we're going to talk about state of mind at the time of a crime, basically assessing for thanatos, and then non corpus mentis, meaning are they psychologically able to stand trial? Are they psychologically fit to stand trial? And so through a mental status exam, you can already begin to figure out what assessments you need to get to assess their functioning in more detail. Okay, so picture the mental status exam as it's going to be an inch deep and about a mile wide, but where there are interesting responses from the client is where you would give more assessments to more deeply or more accurately assess client functioning or defendant functioning. So the first part of this, and it's really hard for us to do online, so some of our objectives today we're not going to do. This is, as you know, an adaptation from our face-to-face class. And I'm actually treating this as a face-to-face class, but this way none of us have to wear masks. So we're going to talk about the MSE. We are not going to be able to apply the video of the client. We won't have time. But normally, if we were in class, we would have a little more time and we would actually show a videotaped interview of a therapist doing a forensic examiner doing a mental status exam with a defendant, a suspect, no, not a defendant yet, a suspect. And then we would write up our MSE results. Okay. So instead, what we get is a little more flexibility in our time because this isn't an online format. So when to do a mental status assessment? If you're working in certain settings that see a great deal of disturbed people, MSEs are mandatory. Like at night, a couple nights a week, I work in a drug rehab, a couple afternoons, evenings a week. And MSEs happen there daily. Like it is just a part and parcel of what we do. In fact, it's quite fun because some of my trainees, they just call it assessment. And I teach them, actually what you're doing is a mental status exam, and a full assessment is actually, and then I teach them about other ways to do other assessments. So emergency rooms, psychiatric wards, mental hospitals, addiction clinics, etc., MSEs are a common practice. Now, likewise, mental status exams are also pretty common in jails and prisons. So they're not ubiquitous like they are in, say, a psychiatric ward, but they're still very common. So if you're working with a client and you notice that their thinking is odd, inconsistent, or loose, then an MSE might be helpful, okay? May actually help you determine where the strengths and weaknesses are that that particular client embodies. So, oh geez, what was it, last week? A new client comes in, she sits down with me, and words start pouring out of her like just a torrent of flood, just words. And she was really trying to communicate something, and part of her sentences made sense, but it's almost like her idea was this big, and she was moving to this idea before completing this idea, and then she was moving on to this idea before completing this idea. And so it was like hearing a whole torrent of half-formed thoughts, okay? Now, in the MSE world, what this is called is it is called pressured speech, okay? And it's usually associated with anxiety, but it can also be associated with other things. Certain mental illnesses, like mania, for example, is part of a bipolar dynamic. So because I couldn't get a sense of the quality of her thinking, then an MSE was called for. And again, it could just be anxiety, or it could be anxiety plus something else going on. But that gives you an idea. Another time, a client came in and would just speak in vague associations. So my mom brought me here in her car. Her car is a Chevy. Chevys were made in Indiana until 1985. They're now made in China. China is one of the largest countries in the world. You know what I mean? Just this, it's called verbal association, where this idea, and then they just start talking about one of the ideas in the previous sentence, and then another idea in this previous sentence, but they're not making a point. They're just talking, right? Just kind of rambling. So association to association, idea to idea. So a couple of things to be aware of: appearance, behavior, and emotion, okay? In fact, we'll talk more about mood and affect here in a minute. So appearance, there's a lot you can tell about people just based on their grooming, their hygiene, the clothing that they wear. So when people are more severely mentally ill, one of the first things that goes away is personal hygiene and self-care. So when clients are severely depressed, where they've been sleeping in their clothes for a week, and that's how their friends carry them into your clinic, or somebody who has been wearing the same clothes for a while because they don't think to change their clothes, regardless, you can tell. Like, imagine, like, this happened a couple of years ago. You're called in to assess a woman who is skeletally thin. She is very, very thin. She's of ambiguous age. She could be anywhere from 24 to 54. You can't quite tell. She's missing many of her teeth, and so when she smiles, there are big gaps and her teeth are yellow. Her hair is disheveled and matted. Her eyes are sunken into her skull. She is wearing what could have been once a white t-shirt from an obscure rock and roll band, and she is wearing a diaper that she has very carefully folded out of discarded newspaper. The diaper is soiled and has been for some time. So you guys begin to see what I mean by how telling our appearance can be? You'll notice that we're not talking about, okay, oh my gosh, her purse does not match her shoes, girlfriend. We don't care about that as mental assessors, right? If they're wearing clothes and their clothes are clean and they don't stink, we're done. But when they're only partially clothed, or their clothes are disheveled, dirty, or smelly, or their personal hygiene is wanting, that's what's interesting in terms of appearance. Height, weight, build can also be interesting. For example, people who are heavier set, people who are overweight, it shows that they have access to food, and that's very important. Somebody who's very thin may or may not have access to food. You don't necessarily know looking at a skinny person, but if a person's overweight, then you have reason to guess they probably have access to food, which is actually a good sign, okay? So you note this, their grooming, their hygiene, right? The clothing that they wear, if it's clean, etc. When you're writing a mental status examination report, you don't write, well, their Versace bag, right? Instead, you could that's irrelevant. It's what you want to look for is physical indications of mental and physical health. That's what you're looking for, and that manifests in terms of what people wear and how good their hygiene is. So you also note up front in your assessment report their behavior. So you want to look at relationships first, in my opinion, right? Other professors are going to teach you something different. Please also listen to them. I don't think that I'm right on this one. This is just a personal preference that I have. It's a bias. Look at how they treat the people around them, right? How are they engaging and responding to you as the interviewer, right? As the psychologist doing the assessment. How are they treating? Are they treating respectfully, disrespectfully? Are they making eye contact, right? Are they avoiding eye contact? Like, how are they treating you? How do they treat the other people around them? Like, if an officer brought them into the room, how were they responding to the officer? Like, all of these things are very interesting in terms of behavior. Then you want to look at other interesting behaviors, things that stand out to you as a little different than the norm. Pacing, repetitive acts, twitching, etc. These kinds of things can be important to note in the mental status assessment. Now, it's interesting that any one thing could be meaningless, but what you start looking for as you're doing the assessment are patterns, especially if you start writing up the results. You want to look at patterns of behavior. Like, are they unable to focus? Is there twitchiness? And we'll talk about assessing that here in a minute. But is there getting up and wandering around? Is that because of pent-up energy? Is it because of hyperactivity? Is it because of mania? Right? You don't know from any one behavior what might be going on with them. Instead, by doing a full assessment, you begin to get a picture that, oh, okay, so these repetitive acts are decaffecting stress because this particular person might be on the autistic spectrum, right? And so, again, you just start looking for patterns, you start looking for trends. So emotion, when it comes to assessing emotion, there's two things that you assess. There's mood and affect, okay? And I think this is on the final exam. I think it's one of those Draper questions. Mood is the client's internal feelings, how they feel inside. And there are 542 mood states in the English language. We are all about our feelings in English. Like in Mandarin, they have something like 50. We have 542. You know what I mean? Like, we are all about our feelings in this culture. And by the way, that not to say people who speak Mandarin Chinese only have a limited truncated form of emotions. It's that their emotional terms are broader and more encompassing than ours are. We get very specific about our emotional states because we're super special princess pony snowflakes. And in fact, one of the things when it comes to mood is you sometimes need to teach the clients, sorry, the assessee, well, I'm going to keep using the term client, come to think of it, but sometimes you need to teach the client about what kind of mood states there are. Just because we have 542 words in the English language about mood states doesn't mean that a given client knows any of those words. Like, one of the guys I did a mental status assessment with in the prison a while ago, is he comes in and I'm asking him, so how you doing? And he said, I'm cool. And as I got to know him, because I did an assessment with him over days, he had two mood states, cool and shitty. I'm cool, I'm shitty. And it was that vague. Like, cool, I came to learn, meant any emotion that he experienced as more positive than not. And shitty was any emotion he experienced as more negative than not. And so it was really vague in that part of the mental status assessment. So there's even a running joke that in therapist's office, you'll see like the mood poster where it's like 16 to 24 faces of little cartoony faces of a different emotional states. There's a reason why therapists have that poster, and it's not just because, you know, they want self-mockery. It's because some people really don't know their mood states, and therefore it can be helpful to have those kind of diagrams around for the clients to refer back to and go, okay, I'm feeling kind of like that cartoon expression, so therefore what I'm feeling is frustration rather than just shitty, or hey, I'm feeling excited rather than cool. You know what I mean? So mood, it's internal. You have to ask about it, right? You don't know a client's mood just looking at them. You may think you know, and you may occasionally be right. You will also often be wrong. So just to put in a plug here for an observation and something I'd like you to keep in mind, too many of my colleagues think they know what's going on with the clients. and they proceed on what they assume to be true. And they're often wrong. And therefore, they're often surprised. And this is sometimes at the client's detriment. So I would encourage you to stay humble. Don't pretend you know what's going on with somebody else. Ask. Like, this is something I even teach when I'm doing couples counseling, that he'll say, well, if she really loved me, she would know what I needed. And I'm like, son of a, I've been doing this psychotherapy thing for 25 years and I don't know. You need to use your words, bro. You know what I mean? Like what do you need? We're not psychic. Our lovers aren't psychic. We're not psychic. Some of you are thinking, I'm psychic. Great, I'm glad you are. Please still ask, because you might occasionally be wrong. Okay? So please ask. Use your words. How do you feel? Right? What do you mean? Well, how do you feel? And if they give you a physical response, well, my elbow hurts. That's interesting. Note that. And then you might follow up, oh, do you feel anything emotionally? But the fact that they brought up a physical complaint first is interesting and may be part of a trend or a pattern. Okay? So affect. So mood, they need to identify, and they need to use their words to identify their mood state. Affect, on the other hand, is what is externally observable. And the list of affect is very low. Like it's a much narrower vocabulary. So you look at manic, hypomanic, euthymic, dysthymic, and melancholic or depressive. There you go. There's the five mood states. So starting at the most energized, it's manic, then step down is hypomanic, and then euthymic, and then dysthymic, and then melancholic or depressive. Okay, we don't really have a hypodepressive. We have a hypomanic, interestingly enough, but not hypodepressive. So euthymic is where you're fine. You're doing cool. You know what I mean? Dysthymic is where you're blue. You're a little bit down. Depressive is where you're barely fine. You've barely got energy. You can barely keep your head up. You know what I mean? That's really low. And then manic is where you're just so hyped and energized, you're all over the place. Where hypomanic is where you're energized and you're agitated, but you're not off the rails like mania is. And so manic, hypomanic, euthymic, dysthymic, depressive. And that's it. And notice it's not depression, it's depressive. You don't know, looking at somebody, whether or not they are feeling depressed, only that they're coming across as low energy, you know, really struggling to sit upright or be part of the conversation, et cetera, because their energy level is so low. Okay. So the other terms that you use are flat, blunted, labile. Okay. And there are other terms as well. There's a few other terms that if you want to get really specific with your MSE, you can use, but I rarely see them. So flat is where, yes, Doc, I'm fine. Yes, the officers picked me up. They told me that I'm under suspicion of having raped my girlfriend. I didn't rape my girlfriend, right? That's where their emotions are just flat. There's no, their affect is flat, right? There's no variation. Where blunted is where their emotions are muted, like they're turned down a bit, but not quite flat. So yeah, the officers came and picked me up and I'm a little bit stressed about this. You know, they said I raped my girlfriend. It's something I wouldn't do, but they said that I did that, right? Well, somebody who's just gotten arrested and being accused of raping their ex-girlfriend, that's really stressful. But you notice that the way I played it out is it's dialed down. It's not quite flat, but it's dialed down, like the emotions are blunted. Then labile is all over the place. Yeah, they told me I couldn't rape my girlfriend. I can't believe they believe that of me. I can't believe that I'm even accused. What's going on in my... It's not fair, right? That's where their emotions are just, it's like a roller coaster, just being in the room with them, of highs and lows, emotionally speaking. Okay, that's labile. Just their emotions are up and down and all over the place. Now, there's a fourth I should actually have here on my slide. I apologize, I don't. And that's WNL, right? WNL, for a lot of these, stands for within normal limits. I should probably have a slide on WNL. Kelly, you're an adult. Would you be so kind on Friday to remind me to edit this slide to make sure that I include the language WNL, because it applies for a lot of things going forward, like have its own little special slide. So backing up to appearance, if appearance is just fine, they're casually or appropriately dressed context, and that would be WNL. Behavior, They're coming in, they're acting like a person being interviewed, and there's nothing stands out or interesting. It's WNL. It's within normal limits. Likewise, emotion, you still want to get their emotion words from them, right? But then when it comes to affect, could very well be it's within normal limits. If I were here, having been accused of sexually assaulting somebody, I'd be pretty stressed out. Their level of stress is commensurate to what's going on. It's within normal limits. Okay, WNL. So you find that when people do mental status exams, they use a lot of shorthand terms. And you'll actually, when you go to graduate school, you'll actually learn what all those shorthand terms are. So you can do a pretty thorough assessment where you're taking very brief shorthand notes under each one of these categories. And then you can unpack that shorthand when you're writing your full report. So the next thing that we often assess is what's called cognitive functioning. One of the biggest, most common parts ever given of a mental status assessment is orientation. So something I forgot to mention that Kelly is reminding me of without knowing that she's reminding me of that is that mental status exams are modular. They're like Legos. So as you're trying to put together a mental status assessment for a given client, you're just picking up what little mini assessments in this macro assessment might be helpful for them. So you can do a full mental status assessment where you go through all the things that I'm talking about in the slide. Oftentimes, though, you can get a pretty accurate picture of the strengths and deficits of somebody very quickly in terms of like triage, in terms of applying basic mental health first aid, or you quite quickly get a sense that they might be severely mentally ill and require a different kind of assessment than the mental status exam. And so one of the reasons why orientation is so commonly used, it's one of the favorite bricks of psychologists as they're building an MSE, is because of how much you learn from that one question. So the question is, who are you and what is your name? Okay, that's assessing to see whether or not they're oriented to person. Place is, do you know where you are right now? Can you tell me your location, city, and so where you are right now and the city, county, et cetera, within which we are located. Time, you can ask them, would you happen to know the day of the week and today's date, right, and time of day? And then situation, do you know why we're here and why we're talking? Okay, that's orienting to person, place, time, and situation. So it's interesting how most of the time when somebody is not severely mentally ill, they're oriented ×4, right? They might not know the exact time of day or the exact place they are, but they know in general where they're at, right? Is today the 13th or is today the 14th? I can't remember, but still that's a normal response when people are stressed out. So the orientation to purpose, it is a sign of severe mental illness when people are deluded about who they are as a person. So when I worked the mental hospital here in Provo, I met a number of Joseph Smiths and a number of Jesus Christs, okay? But when I worked in the hospital down in Austin, Texas, I met Michael Jacksons and Barack Obamas and Bill Clintons and Buddhas, etc. That local culture informs the personal delusions that some people with mental illness have. So if they believe themselves to be otherwise than who they are, then you make a note of that. They're not oriented to person. Like some of you are familiar with Cotard's delusion. Cotard's delusion is pretty rare, but that's where the person believes themselves to be dead. They experience themselves as dead. And so I've had one client look me right in the eye and say, I am the corpse of so-and-so, referring to his actual name, but he believed himself to be a corpse. Well, given the healthy flush to his cheek and the animated way in which he was telling me he was a corpse, there was every reason to believe he was alive, right? So therefore, it's a delusion about person. So place. If they don't know where they are, that's very interesting, right? So imagine you're assessing somebody in a jail and they don't realize they're in a jail. They just say, well, I'm in some kind of bad place and it's really uncomfortable here. Or really tell me about this bad place. And then they start saying things like, those bad men over there, I can see the demons in them and they're keeping me in this bad place, right? They may know who they are. I'm Max Jones and I'm in this bad place with these awful demon people. Well, they're not oriented to place, right? I've met a lot of jail guards, and very few of them what I characterize as demonic. More of them I would characterize, vast majority of them, as just dudes, and a few are downright angelic. So it is interesting when people aren't oriented to where they are. Now, this has also happened in the cases of dissociative fugue. For those of you who took my abnormal psychology class, a dissociative fugue is what happens when somebody has a gap in their memory, a significant gap in their memory, and that significant gap in their memory involves them moving across a space, like not through outer space, but like from here to Cedar City, or from here to Vegas, or from here to Boise, right? That the last thing they remember is this, and now they're kind of coming to and they're in jail and they don't know how they got there, so they don't know what city they're in. That's very interesting. There was one young woman I was assessing some years ago. She remembers she was changing her baby's diaper, and she was in Sacramento, California. And then she remembers waking up in the jail in Spanish Fork. Like that was and she didn't know she was in Spanish Fork. She just knew she was in a jail or a prison. In fact, she kept calling it prison, even though it wasn't prison, it was jail. So I'm in prison, I don't know how I got here, etc. So she wasn't oriented to place. So the last thing she remembered again was changing her baby's diaper. And so her husband came home later that day to find the baby screaming still on the baby changing table. Thank goodness it had little rails on it, so the baby didn't roll off. But the baby's diaper was half on and she was nowhere to be found. The husband looked for her, filed a missing persons report, and she shows up 3 days later, just appears in Spanish Fork, and nobody knows how she got there. You know what I mean? So that shows that somebody doesn't know where they are. That's very interesting. Okay, time. Now, they don't need to know time down to the minute, but they need to know approximate time of day, morning, afternoon, evening, night, right? Is kind of where to start. Like that's still, well, it's the morning. It's probably, let's see, forensic starts at 11, probably about halfway through. So I'm guessing it's about 11:30. Looking down at 11:32. Wow, not bad. Okay. So we can kind of, like, they know approximately what time it is. It's within normal limits. But if they don't know the date or month, see, I don't know, actually, I don't know today's date. Is it the 29th? Nope, it's the 30th. Okay. I don't believe myself to be severely mentally ill, although as an expert, I would need another expert to assess that. But because I know how we tend to misestimate our own mental health and mental well-being. But if they're within the ballpark, they're still oriented to time. It's when they don't know what year or month it is that things are very interesting. You know, I'm assessing a client. He knew the exact time. It turned out there was a clock right over my shoulder. He knew the day and date. It was Wednesday, the 28th, right? But he thought the year was 1932, right? That's very interesting because although I'm old, I'm not that old, right? It wasn't 1932. It was 2012. So interesting, right? And he was very certain it was 1932. So situation. This is often, in my experience, if there is an issue, it is often an issue with situation, but not always. Okay. Like, why are you here is basically the question. Like, do you know why you're meeting with me, why we're having this conversation, why you're in this building, things like that. That in those cases, if they say, I don't know, then you can ask them, why do you imagine? Why do you suppose? And if they stick to I don't know, they're still only oriented times 3, right? Person, place, and time if they've answered those 3 answers correctly. But sometimes people really don't know. To be fair, though, sometimes it's not necessarily because of mental illness. Sometimes it's because of a lack of education. There have been a few clients I've had through the years where they weren't told that they were going to sit down with a psychologist. So they come in and sit down with some dude, this guy, who starts asking them questions, and they don't know why they're being asked. Nobody told them. And in fact, sometimes as the examiner, I'm not sure why I'm there and asking. I was just like, hey, Draper, you're here. Go. We need you in the multi-purpose room. We're going to bring somebody to you to assess. Okay, but I don't know why I'm assessing them. I don't know what's going on there, right? So find out if that's the case, if it's just a lack of education. So, you know, what do you remember? Do you remember being brought here? Where were you brought to? Oh, yeah, I remember being brought here. Oh, and where is here? I don't know. Okay, then that's a lack of orientation, right? But if they don't remember being brought in. And in terms of meeting with you, one of the things that I've learned to do early in my career is to actually educate people up front. Hi, I'm Matt, and I'm a psychologist, and so I've been asked to assess you to see what your strengths and weaknesses are in terms of your mental health, right? And that can clear a lot of things up front. Okay, so I have been waxing eloquent at the camera for more than a couple of minutes. What questions or observations do you all have at this point? Well, the camera flipped to Becky. Hi, Becky.
Hi. So just when you were talking about that orientation ×4, it's really interesting to me. I have a daughter, she's 21, she is epileptic, and we do that orientation ×4 on her every time, like after she has a seizure, because we will ask her, what's your name? And, do you know what time it is? Do you know where you are? Things like that. And a lot of the time she doesn't. Like, it'll take her a good 2 to 4 hours before she recognizes that. Hers is totally like physiological. So how, like it's like physically happening in her brain that she is not able to remember for a certain amount of time because of all the electrical activity that's happened from the seizure.
Okay, Becky, I think I'm confused, but I also think we're on the same page. I think what you mean is the severity of her symptoms, their physiological symptoms, change the way she responds to the mental status exam, right? Because depression is also in the brain, schizophrenia is also in the brain, etc., right? And so those also change our answers. What's interesting with your daughter is that 6 hours after a seizure, she answers very differently than within the first hour after a seizure.
Right.
Whereas somebody who suffers from schizophrenia is probably going to answer the same way for days or weeks, right?
Yeah.
Whereas somebody with depression will also probably answer for days. And so one of the things as a mental health examiner, one of the things you want to make sure is their health record. Like if somebody's having seizures in jail and the guards don't know that they just had a seizure an hour ago and they're brought before me and nobody told me that that person is having seizures or is epileptic, I may write up a bogus report, right? And so that's a risk. You want to find out what you can about your client. So one of the things that we'll touch on is what's called a biopsychosocial history. What's worrisome in cases like your daughter's is when they're brought in, the guards don't know they've just had a seizure, the examiner doesn't know they've just had a seizure, and they can't perform a biopsychosocial because they don't know anything about themselves, right? They're still suffering from post-seizure amnesia. Right. And so, you'd write a pretty bogus report.
Okay.
Or that's a risk. I don't necessarily say you would. Oftentimes, though, people are aware, like in jails and prisons, people are surprisingly rarely alone. And so therefore the other people say, well, that person was on the ground, they're screaming for the guards, come help, so-and-so's freaking out is what the way call it. You and I would say, they're just having a seizure, you know what I mean? Let's be basically precautious, but everything is okay. And so usually it's well known, and therefore you would need to document it in your mental status assessment. But my mental status assessment, I didn't carry it out because the person is still in a post-seizure amnesic state.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Great question. Thank you. Okay, what other questions or observations do y'all have? Okay, the camera flipped to Hannah, but she didn't say anything. Okay, so as they come up, Kelly, would you continue to look for hands in the air?
Oh, Miriam has her hand up.
Miriam does? Dude,
Yeah.
what's up?
Okay, so I'm just a little confused by the wording of like the OX4. Does that mean that the patient is oriented to all four of them? If you like say OX4?
Yep.
Or like OX3, what would that mean? Does that make sense?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you, Miriam. And that was something I'm glad you brought up because I neglected to. So if on my mental status report, I type OX3, then the only one I need to mention is the one they're not oriented to. Client was not oriented to situation. right? And then I would give just a sentence about how the client responded. If I say OX3, but they're actually delusional about themselves, they're suffering from, say, Cotard's delusion. Like one of my clients who believed himself to be Joseph Smith was one of the sharpest, most cognitively present people I've ever assessed. So therefore he was O times 3, but I would note client believes himself to be Joseph Smith. Besides that, he's oriented to place, time, right, situation. So anytime you put anything other than OX4, you specify where they are not oriented.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Very helpful. Okay. So if it seems appropriate, again, a mental status exam is like building a Lego brick of assessments, right? They're like a whole bunch of mini assessments. So if it seems appropriate that there is reason to suspect the patient's memory might be a little off, like especially if they're not very well oriented to time. And by the way, you can do this just because you can do a memory test, just have it be a standard part of your assessment block that you give. But you can also be selective, is what I'm trying to say. So what you do is you give them a number series, okay? Human beings are very good at remembering 7 plus or minus 2 digits. It's one of the reasons why phone numbers are 9 digits, for example, or up to 10 digits. And so you try to give them a number series. I usually go for 7 digits and then see if they remember those. So I'll give them a series of digits and then I'll ask them to repeat them back to me, okay? Another recent memory is, okay, so how did you get here? How did you get to this building or how did you get to this office? And just test to see how their memory is there. And then remote memory, you ask what happened in their childhood, okay? Can you tell me 3 things you remember between the age of 6 and 10, right? See if they can remember anything about their childhoods. Now, the other thing you can do, if you want, is an intermediate memory test. I know that's not here on the slide, but between me and those of you who want to be forensic psychologists later, psychologists in general later, is intermediate memory. So sometimes towards the end of the assessment, I'll ask them to recall the numbers I gave them earlier in the assessment, those 7 digits. And it can be interesting to see how well they're able to hold information in their heads. And so it's not an either or, right? You want to see how approximate they are to the 7 numbers you gave them originally. So that would be more of an intermediate memory. So immediate recall and recent memory is to test for like short-term memory loss, right? It can also, it doesn't necessarily tell you why they have short-term memory loss. It could be because of brain damage, or it could be because they're distracted by internal stimuli like delusions and hallucinations. It can be due to several different things. Remote memory, you are both testing for memory capacity overall, but that's also one that lends itself to trauma. For those of you that have done trauma work, you get used to hearing the refrain, I don't remember my childhood, okay? And so something that you get to assess further as you get to know the client, if they're your client in therapy, is that they can't remember or they won't, right? And sometimes, and often in my case, it's a combination of both. So we'll talk more about the problems of human memory in another unit. But for now, here's a way to assess memory: immediate recall, recent memory, remote memory, and intermediate memory. So attention and concentration. Assess if they're attending to the interview or if they're distracted. Ask follow-up questions if you need to, because sometimes people are kind of moving in their seat and they're not making eye contact very well. They are totally focusing on the interview. You can't necessarily tell based on their behavior. And so you can just follow up with, hey, what's on your mind right now? Like what are the last few things that I said? And if they can repeat it back, even if they seem distracted, they're not. And so that's something to note under behavior rather than attention and concentration. Client fidgeted, moved around in his seat a lot, did not make eye contact, but then under attention and concentration, when assessed, client maintained concentration on the assessment process, okay? So even if they seem distracted, it can be important. So the The other thing is some people's concentration wanes. Like it's not uncommon that as you're doing a mental status assessment, and if you're doing a really thorough one, it can last upwards of 45, 50 minutes if you really get into a detailed one. And the adult attention span starts to strain at about 15 minutes and it taps out at 45 minutes. So it's kind of ironic this class is 50 minutes long. Okay, I will just enjoy that irony by myself. Regardless, yeah, it's fun for me when people come up to me and say, oh, I have ADHD, I can only study for about 30 minutes at a time, and then I just feel distracted and tired. And I'm like, actually, that's well within normal limits. WNL, remember that phrase? That our attention span starts to strain. Like as I look around, some people help themselves concentrate by taking notes. Some people have their phone off the screen. Do you know what I mean? Where they're doing this, trying to distract themselves, kind of help themselves concentrate on something else for a minute. It's pretty cool. It's a way for them to defray their consciousness. Try to. They don't know necessarily they're doing this, but it's a way to kind of relieve the stress of trying to maintain hard concentration for a long period of time. So, but by the way, this is a tangent, but it relates. So some of you have heard the story of when I was diagnosed. Back then it was called ADD, and it was a brand new diagnosis when I was in 5th grade, because they had just invented a drug called methylphenidate, and they were trying to find a way to sell it. And so they invented something called ADD in order to sell that medication to parents, especially of boys, because boys supposedly have a short attention span. Although XX-bodied people, females, tend to have a slightly longer attention span than males. It's really not a huge difference. And so one of the things so my mom was not going to tolerate me being put on medication, especially not an expensive one. And so instead, she's like, okay, how do you study? And I learned that as a kid, I could study for about 15 minutes at a time. And so I would have to do that. She would set a little egg timer down. I would study English or math or history, whatever else, for 15 minutes. And then I would have to go do something else for a few minutes before I was allowed to come back to my studies. And so I still do that to this day. How long am I able to stay on topic before I start wandering off into tangents? Oh, about 10 minutes. Okay. And so when you embrace your learning style, it actually becomes a superpower. Okay, some of you have heard me say that in other classes. So I get help from other people. I don't procrastinate where I'll have to do like 4 hours of studying right before a test because I know I don't have an attention span long enough. So if their attention begins to tap out after only 10 minutes, that's on the shorter side. That's interesting. If they're able to maintain laser beam concentration on the assessment for the full 45 minutes, that's really interesting. You don't necessarily know what that means in a vacuum, but it is interesting that people can do that, and therefore it's noteworthy. So please make a note of it. Okay, so thought processes and speech patterns. These are also very interesting to note. What is the quality of their communication? Do they engage in clang associations, echolalia, for example, both of which are unusual? So clang associations is where they have, like I gave an example earlier, Chevys were built in Indiana until 1982, and then they were built in China, and China is one of the largest countries, but it's not on topic. That shows a clang association where this clangs with this, and therefore it activates those ideas, but they're not really going anywhere in their speech. Echolalia is where they are echoing you back and just repeating back what you're saying, but not like mocking you or doing so derisively. Echopraxia, where they're exactly mirroring your movements, would be interesting to put up in the earlier area of the mental status exam, like under behavior. And those are rare. Looseness of associations is also interesting. Looseness of associations is where you don't know where they're going. They're rambling, but like they're speaking in half sentences, and you can't piece together where the half sentences are going. This was my father-in-law, for example, where you would have to listen to everything he was saying for a few minutes to realize there was a point there. And even then, you weren't sure. Okay, so, well, we was out hauling 10 tons of coal. Legal, because that much coal strains the axles. But as we were driving by, we passed these hookers. They were in a broke down station wagon. So we traded them goods for services. And did you know this thing about coal? No, Bill's a good man, where he was going somewhere and suddenly there's this abort of the idea, and now there's a new idea about Bill, from hauling coal to and trading services with some prostitutes to someone who's talking about Bill, and then he stops talking about Bill and he's talking about slot machines, but he doesn't finish his ideas about Bill, and he didn't finish his ideas about coal. You know what I mean? That's what's called looseness of associations. Oh, I see that I'm out of time. So we will pick up thought processes, speech patterns, etc. next time, do a little review and go on from there. So any questions in closing? Nope. Mark's like, Draper was perfectly clear. Thank you, Mark. Appreciate the feedback, bro. Oh, Natalie's back. Congratulations again, Natalie. That was quite a day you had. Holy cow. And beautiful wedding picture, by the way. So congratulations again. But sorry, Natalie didn't get married.
Thank you.
Somebody she knows and loves did, and it was a beautiful day. Okay, so we will see you all on Friday for those of you that can make it. So bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.